Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to NJJN's webinar on the 2021 Youth Policy Advances. I'm going to start with some brief introductory slides to kind of ground us in what some of these advances were that happened in this past year. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Just a moment. Okay, there we go. So 2021, in spite of the difficult political climate, was a year that saw a large number of legislative advances. We counted 101 in 35 states. And what we're talking about in terms of advances are mostly legislative advances or bills that passed through the legislatures and were signed into law by the governor. It also includes some important court cases and some executive decisions and other policy wins. One of our key campaigns this year was raising the minimum age for prosecution of young people across the country. And we saw a lot of wins in this area. There were 19 states that introduced minimum age legislation, which is terrific, and 8 states that were able to pass legislation. Now, this includes either legislation that raised the age of juvenile court jurisdiction or prosecuting youth in juvenile court, as well as states that raise their age for detaining children or committing children. We also have a campaign to end the for-profit confinement and restraint and seclusion of youth. And here again, we saw some great deal of progress. California ended their out-of-state placements and invested $8 million into community services. We saw 3 states, Illinois, New Mexico, and Wyoming, that closed for-profit CQL facilities. Now, CQL is a corporation that runs various types of locked facilities and residential facilities for children all across the country. And there have been a history of abuses at these facilities. We saw 5 states that passed laws or rules limiting the use of restraint, and 4 states that were able to pass laws limiting the use of confinement or seclusion. We've also been working with members to get racial impact statements passed. We saw Maine passing a racial impact statement law. Maryland, their legislature started a racial impact statement pilot project. And Virginia passed legislation allowing racial impact statements to be requested by certain legislative leaders. And in addition to the wins we just discussed, there were a large number of trends we followed. Seven states addressed expungement and sealing of youth records. 7 states passed reforms to the custodial interrogation process for young people. 8 states passed laws that limit youth from being held in adults' jails pre-trial. This is something required under the JJDPA. 10 states passed laws that limited or ended fines and fees for young people in the youth court system. And 10 states passed legislation limiting the transfer of young people to adult court. If you want to know more, you can check out our website, njjn.org, and download our full 2021 Youth Policy Advances report. So with that, I'm going to introduce our speakers for today. We have Ashanti Jones. As a master's level policy and planning social worker, Ashanti empowers communities to seek systems level change to reduce the impact of inequitable social institutions on people's everyday life. She currently works as the 150 Years is Enough campaign manager at the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, an NJJN member. Kate Wood Kate is a staff attorney with the Juvenile Rights Practice Special Litigation and Law Reform Unit at the Legal Aid Society in New York City. Through her time at the ACLU, Children's Rights, and now Legal Aid Society, Kate has spent the last decade working on litigation and legislative reform on behalf of children in child welfare and juvenile legal systems across the country. Valerie Slater, she leads the Rise for Youth Coalition, which is an NJJN member, and advocates for the rights of system-involved youth. Valerie's dedicated her life's work to advocacy in its many forms to preserve and protect our most valuable resource, our youth. Valerie brings to the RISE team an unwavering commitment to strengthening youth and communities to lead the efforts to realize their visions for change. And Jill Ward. Jill is a director of the Maine Center for Juvenile Policy and Law at the University of Maine School of Law, which is also an NJJN member organization. In her role at the center, she supports juvenile justice clinic students and faculty in their youth justice policy work, and she serves as a resource for statewide system reform. Most recently, Jill co-chaired a juvenile justice system assessment task force in Maine, and currently serves as the chair of the state's Juvenile Justice Advisory Group. So we are going to begin today with Kate Wood with the Legal Aid Society New York, who will discuss S 4051A, which is a bill that raised the lower age of delinquency jurisdiction from 7 to 12 years old. Kate?
New York had set its minimum age for arrest and prosecution of children as delinquents at age 7, which was the second lowest set by statute in the US. And we also had children as young as 10 that could be detained in secure facilities. So in practice, right, this meant young children in New York were being handcuffed, interrogated, put in detention, on probation, and at times in mandatory confinement. And at the Legal Aid Society, we represent the majority of children and youth who are prosecuted in both New York City's family court, which is our juvenile court, and in criminal courts. And so we had clients, as I'm sure many of you have had in your respective states, who would sit in a chair in a courtroom and whose feet couldn't even touch the ground, but they were being prosecuted and arrested and detained. So that's where we started. We were fortunate to be sort of riding a national movement, as Melissa just touched on, to raise the minimum age of delinquency jurisdiction. So that was very helpful for us. And we were also coming in with a common understanding among many legislatures of the harm that comes to children who have early system involvement, right? So we were really able to use a lot of the social science out there and the data that shows that children who have contact with the juvenile system, for example, are 2 times as likely to have contact with the adult system, and how it increases the risk for poor life outcomes in education and relationships and employment. And so that was all, that body of work was all really helpful in pushing this reform in New York. So this issue became a major priority for our organization and for other advocates here, including the Children's Defense Fund. And the key points of the legislation as passed here were: 1, it raised the lower age of juvenile delinquency from 7 to 12, which is still, at least in our opinion, too young, but that's what we thought was a realistic age for us to get past. That includes all offenses except for most homicide offenses, and I'll talk a little bit about that carve out in a minute. The law also ends the use of secure detention for children under the age of 13, except again if they're charged with a homicide offense. And it creates an alternative response pathway for assessment and services for any youth who comes in contact as a result of an incident that previously where the youth would have been charged. There will now be an alternative path for that child and their family through our local departments of social services, which are all county run in New York. The law also provides training both for police and for the local departments of social service staff who will be ensuring these services are provided for families. It also requires that records associated with any services that the family or youth participate in are kept confidential. And it requires state reporting on these programs that are provided to young people and their family and how they're addressing and safety and well-being of these children. So we were very happy with the bill as it was passed. I think a few really important things, in case it's helpful, that really pushed things for us here. One, like I mentioned, that there was already a national conversation about this issue. New York was clearly an outlier in that it had set such a low minimum age in its statute already. We also had a great sponsor of the bill, particularly in our assembly. He was an absolute champion for the bill and really made it a priority. He really argued passionately for it and spent a lot of time behind the scenes with his colleagues. We had great communication with him as well. And so we were able to provide him with a lot of data and social science to support his arguments. And that same data and social science also really helped with some of the pushback that we got about the bill. Like I mentioned, it was relatively easy to convince many legislatures of the harm to children under the current system, but some were concerned about, letting kids off the hook for really egregious crimes, and we got a lot of arguments of that nature. And so it was helpful for us to point out that, to have the data of what children were actually being charged with in New York. So, for example, we knew that 60% of petitions that were filed against 7 to 11-year-olds were for property offenses or for fighting. So we're not talking about these egregious offenses that many legislators were worried about. We did end up with that carve out for most homicide offenses, unfortunately. That was not something that we wanted, obviously, but that's how it ended up being passed. However, no child had been charged with a homicide offense here for, I believe it was the last 5 years. So we really felt like this was a political give that wouldn't have much of a practical effect. We were also very concerned about pushback for additional carve-outs for sex offenses. And again, we pointed out, how rare it is for a child to be charged with a sex offense. And we were armed with a ton of social science to help legislators understand the issue better. So we pointed out that children who display problematic sexual behavior, many were also victimized. The recidivism rate is very low, not a risk to community safety. And so we were able to hold firm on that. And there are no carve-outs for sex offenses. And so we were very relieved about that. Also, in pushing for the bill, it was important to continue to point out to legislators that this is a racial justice issue. We know that arrest and prosecution of young children fall disproportionately on children of color, but we also had data to back that up. So we knew, for example, that 90% of children 7 to 11 arrested in New York City are Black or Hispanic, and that 89% of petitions filed or against Black and Hispanic young people. And I think finally, at least here in New York, and I'm sure it plays out differently in different places, but it was really important for us not to play up this issue in the press, which is sort of counterintuitive to how we usually operate, because many legislators like to have the publicity and the public acknowledgement of their work. And we obviously like to create pressure publicly on legislators to do the right thing and to vote to pass critical reforms like this. But actually, given the timing of it and other criminal justice rollbacks that were actually happening in New York at the same time, it was really important for us to not play this up in the press, and to sort of keep it quieter than usual so that it wouldn't provoke the opposite response and sort of create public pushback on it. So those were a few things that were really important to us in getting this bill passed. I think going forward, so the law doesn't go into effect until this December, and we're really hopeful that it will all go smoothly. But of course, we're going to continue to watch for any possible rollbacks on the law. We're always concerned that there is going to be some incident in the press that gets a lot of attention, for example, the young person accused of doing something, and that there might be some pushback again for additional carve-outs. And so that's something that I think we'll all be on alert for. And I think the other concern too is just the implementation of our diversion program. So making sure that the services are available for young people and families who come in contact with the police or with the departments of social services, and that families are connected to appropriate services, while at the same time making sure that families don't feel like they must comply with those services or that they're compulsory or feel coerced in any way to participate in those services. So those are two things I think we'll keep an eye out. But overall, it was a really significant victory for New York, and I'm just very excited to be able to talk about it.
Great. Thank you very much, Kate. And as I put in the chat, if folks have questions, please put that in the chat. And I'm hoping at the end we will be able to get to that. So I'm going to turn it over now to Valerie Slater from Rise for Youth to talk a little about the racial impact statement bill and some other bills I think she was going to discuss as well.
Thank you so much, Melissa. And it's an honor to be here with you all today. And we're really excited about, it was House Bill 1990 that passed in 2021, and it created the ability to create these racial and ethnic impact statements for up to 3 bills each session. And I know that's a small number, but we were excited that we are able to do this at all. We've just heard from Kate in New York, and we know that it is a national issue, that it is children of color who are experiencing the greatest involvement in the justice system, from arrest all the way to incarceration and lengths of incarceration. And any bills that are passed, we've always got to be looking at how is that going to impact the most egregiously affected individuals. And as I just said, it's always Black kids, brown kids, children of color. And so for us to get this bill passed that basically says, hey, you know what, if there is a bill that is going to be looking at or impacting folks, and it's not just in the criminal justice arena, but any bill that may potentially have an impact that is going to be felt in a disparate way by individuals of any racial group, any ethnic group, then this ethnic and racial and ethnic impact statement can be used as a way to understand exactly what that impact will look like. And the statements, they are put together by a JLARC, that is our Joint Legislative Audit and Review Commission. And what's great about that is they are nonpartisan. It's individuals, all they do is research, and then their research data is put forward. And quite often it is used by folks from both sides of the aisle who are willing to just understand an issue better. And we were really excited also because this bill passed with great bipartisan support. And it was just this year that our first racial and ethnic impact statement was drafted, and it was requested by a conservative legislator, which was also exciting. It was looking at, it was for House Bill 735, and it's repealing a 4-level classification system for awarding and calculating earned sentence credits. So basically looking at whether or not there will be tiers towards how folks are able to earn credit towards release. And we already understood that there were some racial and ethnic issues that were at play that would keep some individuals from being able to earn. But this statement, as it was put forward, how exciting is that, that we were able to lay out very succinctly what those issues are. And when we look at what it took to get this bill passed, again, it was supported by bipartisan. And so we were excited for that. And at the same time, we have also experienced a shift in our legislature this year. It was all controlled by more progressives, and now we have a completely conservative administration. And so as we are looking at how to navigate this new political climate that we find ourselves in, we are hopeful that this particular bill is going to be something that we are able to count on, to rely on, to maybe convince some of the more conservatively leaning individuals. As Kate was talking about that, establishing a minimum age, that's a wonderful thing. We attempted to do that and it failed and during this session. And we can't incarcerate anyone until 11 years old, but we were unwilling to put into place a minimum age of jurisdiction. We were looking to get a racial and ethnic impact statement on the minimum age. We were a little late in the request, and so it didn't go through, but nevertheless, as we are looking at some of these issues that we already know are impacting specifically Black and brown kids more disparately, we are looking forward to using this piece of legislation to draw more light. And oftentimes we're fighting a battle that is often looked at through a fiscal lens, but nevertheless, if we are able to bring to bear just how disparately the treatment is, or just how disparate the treatment is for Black and brown children, then we'll be able to get more community members, more legislators perhaps that are going to care about what does it look like for those who are from particular communities and who have a particular racial or ethnic makeup. Another bill that I wanted to talk about that we were able to pass during the 2021 session was House Bill 1912, and that ended the collection of child support from the families of incarcerated children. And we were able to figure out that this was even going on here in Virginia. We at Rise for Youth, we put together a support group for the family members of incarcerated children during the pandemic. In 2020, when it first kicked off, we realized that not only were children locked down for 23 hours a day, but family members weren't able to talk to their loved ones. They weren't able to go and visit them. And so it was placing just a tremendous amount of stress on family as well. So we put together a space for them, a virtual space for them to come together so that they could share what information they were receiving, so that they could be a support group for each other, and that we at Rise for Youth, we would be able to hear some of the issues that were being experienced by these family members and by their children, and that we would then be able to advocate. We had a parent whose child had just recently been adjudicated delinquent, had just recently gone in, and she received a child support notification from the state saying that she was going to have to pay an amount of money to the state for while her child was incarcerated. Well, this was a single mother, and she had 3 other children at home, and she was very concerned because she wasn't going to be able to afford this amount of money that had just been she had just been told she would have to pay to the state. We had another parent on the call who shared with us that her and her husband had each received their own child support notification. Now, they were a married couple living together, and each of them got their own child support notice, and it totaled more than $1,300. They were able to go to the court and get that amount reduced, but it made us wonder how many parents didn't even know that that was an option, and how many parents are just struggling. And this particular parent who said her child had just been incarcerated, she says, I don't know if I'm going to be able to do this because I've got to feed my children, and I can't pay the state and not feed my children. And we were able to then garner support from other groups, and we successfully passed this piece of legislation. And there were so many legislators that were unaware that it was even a thing, right? How many folks weren't even aware? And as we talked to folks just across the Commonwealth, most folks didn't know that parents of incarcerated children had to pay the state. Everyone immediately thought, oh, well, just because a child's incarcerated doesn't mean that that parent shouldn't pay the other parent child support. And so we had to explain to them that no, this was an order put in place by the state to collect money because the child is now in the state's custody. And so once we were able to educate and inform, we were able to lift up very clearly that, again, it impacts individuals from lower income communities. It predominantly impacts Black and Brown families, and that it is putting an undue burden on families. And also we noted that that money was going into DJJ's general operating budget. It was not even going to the direct care of the children whom, you know, supposedly the support was being collected on behalf of. And so, and then it was less than 1% of DJJ's operating budget. And so DJJ didn't even object to ending this practice. So we had strong bipartisan support, we had strong agency support, and we were able to, with a very strong and dedicated patron, get this bill passed. And we're so excited to have done that. And so we have already seen families have just overwhelmingly talked about how this has been a wonderful revelation for them, that they are no longer owing the state money. There has been no impact to the department because they already had stated to us that they would be able to absorb this minimal expense. And so overall, we have seen several thousand families have been helped because all of these orders that were already in place, they have now been canceled. All of the orders that were pending to come, they've all also been canceled. Unfortunately, we were unable to do anything about the arrears. If anyone still owes money, that money is federally, you are not able to erase that debt. And so there are families that are still struggling to get out from under that burden, but at least there will be no new accrual of child support for families. So these are two bills. And again, I shared that we're under a very new administration here in the Commonwealth, and some of the things that we thought would be kind of common sense and helpful in ways, they all crashed and burned this session. But you know what, we fight on. We fight on, and we continue to believe that good will come if we continue to fight for it. So I'm glad to share what we were able to accomplish here in Virginia.
Thank you, Valerie. Those are both really exciting achievements. And I know that it's a difficult political situation, so all the more kudos to you guys. And I know that will help a lot of people. So I'm going to try to turn it over to Ashanti now. I know she's had some technical problems, so we're going to see if we can make this work through a phone connection. So Nadine, see if you can help to make that happen.
Hello. Can you all hear me?
We can hear you. Great. Go ahead, Ashanti.
Wonderful. Hi, everyone. I'm so sorry for those technical difficulties, but I'm really happy to be presenting here today about the great work that we've been able to do in New Jersey to just kind of move youth justice forward. So, and back in, I want to say like 2018, we began having conversations with community members around kind of the things that were landing our young people in jail or prison. And what we found is that we have the worst racial disparity rate in the nation, right? 18-1. It was 21-1, where Black kids are 18 times more likely to be incarcerated. And so what we did is we went into those overwhelmingly African-American communities, and we talked about the kind of resources that were available to their young people versus what wasn't, right? And what's available in the communities where the young people are being diverted to. And then we had a conversation, and the majority, overwhelmingly, of folks were saying that they'd love to see restorative justice and transformative justice programming kind of being for our young people. New Jersey, it really lauds its like a JDAI, its juvenile diversion programs, and how they've been so effective in, reducing our juvenile justice population, but it's done very little to get rid of that racial disparity rate, because JDAI unfortunately, predominantly provides diversion for kids who are white. And so when we went into those communities, having conversations around what transformative justice really looks like and what restorative justice really looks like, people were saying that, we kind of need this for young people. This has to be an option for those Black and brown communities that are without those resources that the other communities have. And so we took a look at what they were doing in Oakland with like Restore Oakland. We took a look at Chicago's programs. We took a look at Baltimore, Maryland's programs with restorative justice. And what we first did was we pulled together an evidence-based document that pretty much highlighted the successes that we were able to see with restorative justice programming across the country. And we sent that to every legislator that was on the Law and Public Safety Committee as well as the Budget Committee. And we sent a document basically saying, like, people want these types of programs, and they have a proven success rate, and we should think about implementing that in New Jersey. We were met with a lot of resistance with that particular option. However, what we then did was have people tailor this program, right? We went back into the communities and said, if you were to have this program in Patterson, what would it look like? And so we took, we took those conversations and we turned that into a toolkit called our Youth Justice Transformation Toolkit, which outlined a restorative justice hub, right? All the different components, how you would apply for the grant, how you would engage community members around it, and what kind of programs would be offered in that hub. And that hub toolkit eventually got turned into legislation called the Restorative and Transformative Justice for Communities and Youth Pilot Program Bill, which was passed actually in August 2020. And so what that bill did, it really literally took the community's perspective on what they'd love to see with restorative justice programming, and it turned it into a tangible bill that can actually be funded. And it took $8.4 million, which is about 20% of the JJC's operating budget, to incarcerate our young people. And it took that $8.4 million and established 4 of those restorative justice hubs in Newark, Trenton, Camden, and Patterson, 4 of the cities where the majority of our young people who are incarcerated come from. And that was established in August of 2020, and we're now in 2022 and about to begin actually funding some of the community partners who want to become restorative justice hubs. And so this was a big win for us, because we've not had that type of investment for a single community-based program in New Jersey in a long time. JDI has been kind of like where all of our money has been going, but $8.4 million is nothing to like laugh at. Because we spend around $608,000 to incarcerate our young people, at least one young person, annually in New Jersey. And so it was really imperative, it was really a big deal that our state allocated that $8.4 million to provide those restorative justice programs. And so we're now at the stage where we're starting to fund those programs, and we'll start the 2-year pilot. And then hopefully at the end of the 2 years, we'll be at a space where we can advocate for full state implementation. I know that the state had just released in the last budget an anticipated $100 million to go to the youth services commissions, where the restorative justice hubs are actually being funded through. And so hopefully we'll be able to use that $100 million to establish these restorative justice hubs as a staple in how we handle our young people.
Great. Thank you, Ashanti. That's really wonderful news to hear, and look forward to hearing how it all plays out, and so happy that the state is investing this money. And I'm happy we could hear from you. So I'm going to turn it over now to Jill Ward to talk to us about some of the legislation they passed in Maine.
Thanks, Melissa. Really happy to be with you all here today as well. And apologies if my voice is a little scratchy. I've been, COVID finally got me a week and a half ago. And so I have some of the lingering effects that some of you may be familiar with, but I'm really happy to be here, and was really excited to see visually in Melissa's PowerPoint, Maine represented in so many of these categories. Melissa had asked me to talk a little bit about the legislation Maine has passed around seclusion, use of seclusion and restraint in schools, and I'm going to talk about that bill in a minute. But I did want to note, much like Kate covered, we had legislation to create a minimum age of juvenile court jurisdiction here. And through the sausage making process that is legislation, we ended up with some limits around the use of detention and confinement, but didn't actually get to a minimum age for juvenile court jurisdiction overall, and that we may hope to revisit that. But I'm happy to speak to any of the circumstances and what that debate looked like here in Maine. I think there are some similar challenges when it comes to trying to talk about establishing that floor for children. We also had legislation improving record confidentiality for juveniles. We also had LD2, which was our racial equity statement with legislation as a practice. And we are in the pilot making phase. We passed the legislation the first session, so last year, and it came with implementation instructions. So those racial equity statements are applying to a handful of bills that were selected to allow the legislature to practice, essentially making this a regular practice with our legislative process that any legislator can request with a bill. So we are keeping an eye closely on how that is being implemented and can answer questions about that as well. But I did want to spend just a couple of minutes here lifting up there were three bills that address the school to prison pipeline and the use of seclusion and restraints and inappropriate, if we could say, practice in schools. And the first one was LD 1373. And I think we're going to drop into the chat just a summary of all these bills I've touched upon for everybody's reference. You can take a look and get a little bit more detail and links to the actual legislation. But the first bill, LD 1373, was an act to keep all Maine students safe by restricting the use of seclusion and restraint in schools. And the most important thing about this bill is it raised the bar for use of these practices to one of the sort of best standards nationwide, basically. And it provides very clear definitions for seclusion, restraint, and the entities that are covered by the legislation. I think some of you who may be doing some work around solitary confinement are used to the slippery slope of definitions and how jurisdictions and agencies define things can shift and move, and it makes it really sometimes difficult to nail down what practices and behaviors you're really trying to limit or ban altogether. So this bill had really good definitions for those terms. It limits the use of physical restraints and seclusion to instances where the student's behavior poses imminent danger to themselves or others, and there are no less restrictive interventions available. And it is also clearly limited to the least amount of force necessary to protect the student or another individual, and must immediately cease upon the demonstration of that behavior that is trying to be restrained. So really sort of a point in time, very, 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 very limited sort of circumstance where any kind of physical restraint can be used with a child. And it requires the Maine Department of Education to provide technical assistance to schools to really engage in those efforts and whatever administrative support they need to reduce the use of restraint and seclusion in schools. And there is a data requirement, a data reporting requirement also. So really trying to support implementation and monitor what is going on, in addition to being very clear about what is prohibited. So that bill was a really important bill. And then there were two more I'd like to mention. There was one to align the expulsion process with school disciplinary policies to really also get a handle on the use of expulsion in schools and align school discipline policies with due process standards, with better education among school practitioners and families and parents to really understand what is not appropriate to be happening to their children in schools, and to encourage the use of restorative options by superintendents and principals as much as possible, really incentivizing that as an alternative response to some of the behaviors. So that was LD 1451. And then there was a third bill, LD 474, which had to do with prohibiting expulsion for Maine's youngest children. Much like a minimum age of juvenile court jurisdiction, there was a move, there has been a move, I think, in other jurisdictions, certainly reflected in Maine, to set some minimum standards about when you can actually expel a child from school. And so this was an attempt to make it really clear that kids in grade 5 or below really shouldn't be subject to expulsion, that schools need to be empowered to keep kids in the classroom, in the school and learning, and respond to behavior issues more appropriately than just kicking them out of school and having that time not be productive for the young person or their family to be able to handle it, and then they wouldn't be getting their education. So there was that sort of triad of bills that really were an attempt to deal with keeping kids in school and responding to kids' needs appropriately in those contexts, without causing any harm or violating any due process rights or their own sort of physical autonomy. So I think maybe, Melissa, with that, I'm wanting to leave some time for questions. Happy to answer questions on those bills. I will also lift up one more thing. We did a lot of things in Maine last year as part of the minimum age legislation that we did pass that set 12 as a minimum age for detention, and then 12 to 14. It's a higher standard to confine someone to commit someone to secure confinement between the ages 12 and 14. That bill also limited the mandatory minimum for commitment for juveniles and added some other due process protections by assigning counsel to committed children so that there were more judicial reviews of kids who were locked up in our one secure facility, and really trying to, the theme was keep them out of those settings as much as possible and shine as much light on those settings when young people are incarcerated in those kinds of facilities. And so we had quite a bit of success in really trying to address those key principles with some of the legislation we saw last session. So I'll pause there, Melissa, and turn it back to you.
Great, thank you, Jill. And it's exciting to see all the legislation that Maine passed. So I'm just going to throw out a question to all the panelists now, but for folks here with us today, if you have a question to ask, you can either do the hand raise button in the chat or write the question in the chat. But my question to start us off is, so each of you were able to get some great legislation passed, and this was during a year of a lot of moral panic over the rising crime rates, and a lot of states experience frustration in trying to move some youth and adult legislation forward. So what would you say were ways that you were able to progress during this difficult time, or any advice you'd have, or anything like that? And okay.
Is it okay if I speak?
Yeah, go ahead, Ashanti. Yeah.
Okay, okay, great. I think that the one thing that I would say as a piece of advice is to try every way that you can to convince your legislators to do the right thing for our young people. I know that for a lot of legislators, they boil down to dollars and cents, but it's very important for us to see the humanity behind a lot of these issues, that we're not just talking about, we can't just write off our young people, right? Our young people are our future, right? They are the people who are going to drive our society forward. And so we have to invest in them meaningfully, and that they're not just criminals, right? They're not just people who need to be written off. And so when we tried to pass our law, the first thing that we did was try to convince them, right, of the statistics, right, and kind of logic our way to legislation and a meaningful investment in our young people. And it kind of went nowhere because, for them, the statistics that we were showing them, it just wasn't worth the dollars and cents. However, getting the real emotion and having those parents, right, and having those young people actually be the face of all of this and say, when we pulled together that toolkit, it wasn't something that the Institute just did, right? This was the result of the blood, sweat, and tears of people who were personally impacted by this problem. So we were able to appeal to them in a different way not necessarily using the statistics that we thought would have moved them, but really transitioning our strategy just to appeal from a different angle. And I think that we have to try various different ways to get the same thing passed. And so that piece of advice is just to, if the first thing doesn't work, just come back to the table and figure out another angle, but everything is possible.
Great, thank you. Would any of the other panelists like to respond? Oh, it looks like Bill, I'll start with Jill, and then go to
Just
Valerie.
really quickly, I'm echoing, I think, a little bit of what Ashanti is talking about, but as much as you can to support and work with impacted communities to tell their own stories about what the policy is and how it impacts them or did impact them if they experienced it, is incredibly powerful. And it does move legislators when it's not someone like myself at from a policy perspective, talking about a best practice and giving the data, but actually parents and young people telling their stories about how they felt, about what the impact of the policy negatively had on them, or what the policy you're advocating for would positively have on them, I think is incredibly powerful. And trying to work with youth and families and support them and empowering them to be able to have the space to tell their story, because the legislative process can be a little bit intimidating. And over Zoom, it was also like, when do you show up? How do you show up? How do you get in the queue? How do you only speak for 3 minutes and be impactful? So I think there's a lot we can do from a policy perspective, those of us who do this work, to really support that. And I think it does make a difference.
Great, thank you for that. And Valerie?
For sure. And I know that I am also kind of echoing. I agree 100%. It's so important for the folks who have been impacted to be the ones sharing what that impact has been on their lives, on the lives of their loved ones, and then making it easy for them to share. We had some parents that wanted to speak. We had some parents that were willing to write something and allow that to be submitted. We had some parents who were like, if I give you bullet points, will you share? But giving them the autonomy to let their story be told by them, through them, written, but however they choose, letting it be 100% their choice, and letting them know just the impact that will have. Because this was something that, like Ashanti was saying, we attacked from all of the different angles. We had TCI, the Commonwealth Institute for Fiscal Analysis, they did the analysis financially to say this is less than 1%. We had the agency say, hey, we can absorb that. We had families saying, this is what this has done to me. We had a parent saying, I can't, I've got to make the tough choice to either pay you or take care of my kids. So we left nothing to chance. We advocated in all of those different ways. And this was a parent that preferred to have her statement written and submitted. We had another parent say, you know what, I just really like the way you talk. Will you read mine? Right. And so, but nevertheless, all of those voices were heard. And the governor did the ceremonial signing for this particular bill, because even he was so moved by, I believe it was the personal stories that mattered the most, but that every angle was used and every way to tell the story was provided to those parents.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Valerie. And Kate, I don't know if you had anything else you wanted to add.
I'll just add the one thing that I touched on previously is that, the press can be helpful or harmful, right? And for us in this particular climate where there were already a lot of proposed rollbacks to other criminal justice reform in New York, it was really important for us to keep kind of things quieter than we usually would and not play it up in the press and not have that pressure on legislators who we were finding largely were in agreement that this was the right thing to do, but didn't necessarily want to deal with any potential public heat from it. And so that really worked to our advantage in this climate.
Great. Yeah, that's a good point. Also, thank you, Kate. So we had one question, I think for Ashanti, and this is asking if you know who in New Jersey received the Restorative and Transformative Justice for Youths and Communities Awards.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that question?
Yeah, so they wanted to know who received the Restorative and Transformative Justice for Youth and Communities Awards in the 4 cities. I guess which organizations?
Gotcha. So that's not how it's being funded. So what's happening is, so it's a 2-year pilot program, and each of the 4 cities is going to get an equal share of that money. So each city is going to get about $2 million per for the pilot program. And so what's happening is the money goes to the youth services commissions from the JJC, and then various organizations can apply. So if you are a part of an organization who is in one of those 4 cities who wants to apply for, to become a hub, you can apply directly to your county youth services commission to receive funding. So that's how it'll work. No one has gotten it yet.
Okay, great. Thank you, Ashanti. So I'm just looking through. I don't think I see any other questions. So since we're just about at time, I'm going to just close this out. And I want to really thank our panelists. I appreciate you so much, and appreciate all the work that you're doing. And thank you for coming to, let people know about some of these really important bills that were passed, and some of the challenges and hurdles you overcame to do that. And I thank everybody, all of our participants, for being present here, and just wish everybody a great day. And thank you again. Bye.